Carlos was the typical successful man, someone who had achieved everything he wanted in life. At 40, he had an enviable career in the business world, a luxurious apartment in the city center and a state-of-the-art car. For many, Carlos was the personification of a perfect life, an example of perseverance and merit. However, beneath this facade of accomplishments, there was a characteristic that further differentiated him: his profound contempt for religion and any form of faith. From a young age, Carlos always believed that success depended exclusively on effort and intelligence. He grew up in a modest family, where he learned to fight for everything he wanted. This teaching became his philosophy of life, and, over the years, he came to see faith as something useless and outdated. "God is just an invention for the weak," he used to say mockingly. For Carlos, those who believed in God were just people who did not have the strength to face life's challenges on their own. His attitude toward religion was not just indifferent, it was hostile. Whenever someone mentioned faith in conversation, he made a point of mocking or deflecting the topic with sarcastic jokes. For him, life was about concrete results, and he had proven this by building his fortune with his own hands. In his words, success was the result of hard work, not prayers or beliefs. Co-workers and friends were used to Carlos' cynical ways. They knew that any mention of God would be immediately followed by a cynical laugh or an acid joke. During social gatherings, he often ridiculed those who believed in something beyond what was palpable. "Do you still believe in miracles? I believe in the stock market," he said with a self-confidence that bordered on arrogance. His mother, a devout woman, was one of the few who still tried to open Carlos' eyes to something bigger. She always said tenderly, "Son, not everything is about what we can see or touch. There are things that go beyond our understanding." But instead of listening, he just smiled and replied, "Mom, I built my life with work, not with prayers. I don't need God for that." Over time, Carlos became increasingly isolated in his belief in self-sufficiency. He believed his success was proof that he didn't need anyone, much less a divine force. For him, the only God was himself, the only one responsible for everything he had. His arrogance grew in proportion to his material possessions, and he felt invincible, believing that life was simply a matter of control and power. However, little did he know that life often has its own ways of showing unexpected lessons. What Carlos still didn't understand is that there are times when the control we think we have over destiny is merely an illusion. And for someone who laughed at God every day, the universe was about to teach him a bitter lesson, a lesson that would change his view of the world forever. Carlos' routine was marked by his constant disregard for faith and anything related to God. In office, he was known as much for his business brilliance as for his unforgiving views on religion. During coffee breaks or team meetings, Carlos made a point of positioning himself clearly. For him, faith was a crutch for the weak. "While some waste time praying, I'm here doing what really matters. Working and making money," he said proudly. His colleagues, many of whom were discreet in their beliefs, avoided contradicting him, aware that he did not back down when it came to his disbelief. Carlos took special pleasure in ridiculing any display of public faith. When a colleague said he had gone to church to thank him for a promotion, Carlos laughed out loud, mocking the idea. "Thank God? You should be thanking yourself for working hard, not an invisible being," he said sarcastically. And so, with the confidence of someone who considers himself superior, he diminished any act of faith, convinced that the world was moved only by tangible and rational actions. Carlos' jokes also extended to his personal life. At dinners with friends and even in casual meetings, he always found an opportunity to criticize religion. If someone mentioned something about attending mass or praying before meals, Carlos would quickly interrupt with a scathing comment. "Do you really believe anyone is listening? That's just tradition. What matters is what we do, not what we believe." His laugh echoed in conversations, making it clear that, for him, faith was something outdated and meaningless. His mother, devout and full of hope that her son would one day change, always tried to get Carlos to see things differently. She invited him to attend masses and always mentioned that she prayed for him. But for Carlos, this was just another opportunity to laugh. "Mom, Spend your time on more productive things. Your prayers didn't help me get to where I am. It was my job, he insisted, not realizing how much these words hurt his mother. This arrogant attitude only increased his sense of superiority. Carlos saw himself as someone who controlled his own destiny, without the need for a superior force to guide him. He thought the world was divided between those who took control of their lives and those who took refuge in faith to seek solace in something that, in his view, did not exist. For him, faith was a weakness, an escape from reality that only delayed progress. Over time, Carlos became increasingly proud of his disbelief. It wasn't enough to just not believe in God. He needed to demonstrate this to everyone around him. It was common for him to comment on how he felt freer and more self-assured because he didn't depend on something imaginary to find strength or comfort. His motto was simple. Life was about concrete actions, smart strategies, and constant effort. Anything beyond that was a waste of time. He felt unbeatable, living the life he believed was the example of success. While the people around him sought comfort in their prayers and beliefs, Carlos found satisfaction in his material gains and his ability to solve any problem with his own mind. He saw himself as living proof that God did not exist. After all, in his view, everything he had was the exclusive result of his hard work and choices. This continued disregard for faith caused Carlos to become emotionally distant from many around him. Friends and family, aware of his intolerance towards religion, avoided the topic. However, what he didn't know was that his absolute belief in control over his own life was about to be drastically shaken. The lesson he would receive would be harsh and unexpected, and would show that, regardless of our certainties, destiny often has plans that go beyond our understanding. Carlos' friends and family had long ago noticed his rigid and arrogant stance towards faith, but it was his mother, a devout and wise woman, who was most concerned. For her, the fact that her son openly mocked God and any form of belief was a source of great distress. Despite all his attempts to bring him back to a path of respect and spiritual understanding, Carlos always responded with sarcasm. "Mom, I respect your faith, but you don't need to worry about me. I'm just fine without these old beliefs," he said with a condescending smile. Several of Carlos' friends also began to notice his increasingly disrespectful attitude towards religion. In casual meetings or social gatherings, it was common for him to make jokes, not only about faith in general, but also about the personal beliefs of those present. His best friend, Pedro, who has always been religious, tried to talk seriously with Carlos. "Man, I understand that you don't believe it, but have you ever stopped to think that, perhaps, playing with something that is sacred to others might not be the best attitude?" said Pedro, worried. Carlos, however, never took these warnings seriously. "Pedro, I am a man of logic and facts. Religion is for those who cannot face reality. I know very well what I'm doing," he replied with an air of superiority. He believed that his choices and worldview were the only valid ones. For him, living without the influence of faith made him stronger and more self-sufficient. The idea that he might be making a mistake or offending something higher up was simply laughable. His mother, on the other hand, wouldn't give up. With a soft but firm voice, she tried to warn him in a loving way. "My son, the world is full of mysteries that science cannot explain. Don't play with things you don't fully understand. God is always present, even when we don't believe." She prayed every night for Carlos to change his stance, but he, stubborn and sure of his convictions, just nodded and left the conversation aside. In his view, his mother was trapped in an outdated mentality, and he, as a modern man, could not let himself be influenced. These warnings intensified over time, especially when Carlos began to be even more public with his disrespectful jokes and comments. He loved discussing religion at dinners or social gatherings, provoking heated debates, always with the intention of showing how superior he was for not believing in God. On some occasions, his friends even walked away, feeling uncomfortable with the aggressive tone he used to talk about faith. But Carlos didn't seem to care about that. "I understand that everyone has their beliefs, but let's be realistic. Do I believe in an invisible being who controls everything? That's a thing of the past. I'm focused on my career, on concrete things. That's my religion," he said with an arrogant laugh. His friends tried to argue that respecting others' beliefs was important, but Carlos was so fixated on his worldview that he wouldn't allow anything to make him doubt his perspective. As time passed, even those closest to Carlos began to notice that his arrogance regarding religion was becoming an obsession. Instead of just not believing, he seemed to have a constant need to ridicule any mention of God or spirituality. His mother, increasingly distressed, continued to pray, asking God to touch her son's heart before it was too late. "Carlos, my son, I fear what may happen if you continue to challenge what you don't know," she said with tears in her eyes at a family dinner. But once again, Carlos ignored him. He believed he had complete control over his life, his decisions, and his destiny. Nothing, not even heartfelt warnings from his mother and friends, could change that. For him, life would continue to be as he always planned. Logical, practical, and with no room for superstitions. However, he had no idea that something was about to happen. Something that would shake his convictions and force him to reevaluate everything he believed. The first signs that something was changing in Carlos' life appeared in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. It all started with small setbacks at work. He, who had always been considered an impeccable and organized professional, began to make mistakes that were not part of his profile. Important documents were misplaced, relevant meetings were forgotten, and crucial projects began to fail. Initially, he treated these events as mere coincidences, thinking that it was just a bad phase and that everything would soon return to normal. The situation, however, began to escalate. His team at work, who always respected him, began to question his decisions. Previously praised reports were now full of criticisms and corrections. Carlos, proud and arrogant, blamed others. "The people around me are incompetent. If something is going wrong, it's not because of me," he told himself. But no matter how hard he tried to mask the problems, the impact was increasingly visible. His professional reputation, which he valued so much, was beginning to suffer. On a personal level, difficulties also began to manifest themselves. Relationships that were once stable began to fray. Close friends began to walk away, angered by Carlos' constant arrogance. He noticed that more and more people avoided being around him. Dinners and meetings that were once frequent have become rare. When he tried to make jokes or acidic comments about faith or life in general, the forced laughter of his colleagues indicated that no one else found it funny. He began to feel isolated, but still refused to accept that this was a result of his own actions. Even at home, Carlos began to face a series of problems. Small accidents happened frequently. He lost his house keys several times, his car started to fail unexpectedly, and even household appliances broke down for no apparent reason. What he previously considered a controlled and predictable life now seemed to be going off track. However, instead of stopping and reflecting, Carlos insisted that they were just temporary bad luck, something that happened to anyone. He still refused to accept the signs. Each new problem was treated with contempt, as if the world was just unfairly conspiring against him. In conversations with his few remaining friends, Carlos blamed bad luck and laughed at the idea that something bigger was at stake. "Problems come and go, it's no big deal. That's just how life is. But I, unlike others, know how to deal with it," he repeated, still full of confidence. To him, the idea that these small misfortunes could be a warning from fate was laughable. His arrogance, however, only widened the gap between him and the people around him. Even his mother, who was always by his side, began to notice that Carlos was distancing himself from everyone. She tried once again to counsel him, saying that perhaps these problems were signs that he needed to reconsider his approach to life. "Carlos, sometimes God sends us little signs to make us reflect. Don't you think it's time to stop and think about the path you're taking?" she suggested in a worried call. But as always, he laughed. "Mom, please, these are just coincidences. I'm not going to change who I am because of some bad luck." The disregard Carlos showed for the signs around him began to turn into a cycle of frustration. He became easily irritated, took his anger out on those close to him, and began to further push away the few who tried to help him. Everything he saw as solid in his life, both at work and in personal relationships, began to slowly disintegrate. Even so, His arrogance did not allow him to admit that something was beyond his control. As much as he tried to remain calm and indifferent to small misfortunes, Carlos began to feel the accumulated weight of so many adversities. Instead of reflecting on his actions, he became increasingly irritated. Seeing everything around him gradually crumble, he refused to accept that these problems could be something deeper, a reflection of his own choices and attitudes. For Carlos, everything was a matter of unfortunate coincidences. The great setback in Carlos' life arrived like an unexpected storm, overturning everything he believed to be solid and unshakable. He was used to controlling every detail of his life, both at work and in personal relationships, but now, for the first time, he found himself in a completely vulnerable position. The event that would change everything began with an important business meeting, where Carlos had full confidence in his ability to close a contract that had been his biggest bet in recent months. It was $1 million project which would guarantee not only his prestige, but also a significant promotion within the company. However, what he didn't expect was that his arrogance and disregard for the opinions of others would end up sealing his fate. During the meeting, he made a point of ignoring the team's advice and made decisions on impulse, believing that, as always, his instinct and unwavering confidence would guide him to success. But what happened was the opposite. The contract was lost to a competitor, and the company suffered a huge loss. The news spread quickly, and soon Carlos was called by the company's directors to explain what had gone wrong. In that meeting room, where he was previously seen as a reference for success and leadership, Carlos found himself trapped. His bosses were unwilling to forgive the mistake, and with financial pressure mounting, the decision was immediate. He was fired. For the first time in many years, Carlos felt the ground slip away from beneath his feet. He who always laughed at others and believed he was in control of everything, now faced a reality that he could no longer control. Losing his job deeply shook his confidence, and he began to realize that his perfect world was beginning to crumble. Upon returning home, the feeling of failure was overwhelming. Carlos, who always boasted of his financial independence and professional success, now found himself aimless. Worse still, the crisis at work quickly spilled over into his personal life. His wife, who had been trying for months to warn him about his arrogant and distant behavior, now saw the dismissal as the end of a relationship that was already collapsing. The loss of a big contract was just the trigger for a series of arguments that ended up culminating in an inevitable separation. Carlos, who always thought that nothing could take him from the top, was now alone and unemployed. The friends he disdained for their faith and simplicity also began to drift away. Without the status that once surrounded him, Carlos realized that his arrogance had created a wall between him and the people around him. He, who had always scoffed at the idea that life could be affected by anything other than his own actions, began to realize that not everything was under his control. For the first time, he felt the bitter taste of defeat. The financial crisis that followed the dismissal was relentless. Carlos, who had always lived in luxury and ostentation, now struggled to keep his house and pay his debts. Every day was a battle to try to reorganize his life, but nothing seemed to work. Job offers did not appear, and the name that was once synonymous with success in the market was now tarnished by the mistake he made. He went from someone who controlled his destiny to a man at the mercy of circumstances. Loneliness became his only company. He was no longer the man who looked down on others for their faith, but now he began to question his own unbelief. Is this all a coincidence? He asked himself silently. Little by little, Carlos moved away from the world he knew. He stopped going out, isolated himself from the few people who still tried to get close, and the anger he felt at the world began to transform into a deep, bitter pain. Carlos never imagined his life would fall apart like this. He, who had always believed he was invincible, was now completely adrift. The arrogant smiles, the dismissive jokes, the contempt for those who believed in something beyond the visible, all of it now seemed ridiculous in light of the relentless reality he faced. The pride that had always guided him was destroyed, and Carlos no longer knew where to run. The great setback Carlos faced was greater than he could have ever imagined. He was finally being confronted with the truth he had avoided all his life. He was not infallible, and life could not be controlled by the strength of his will and arrogance alone. Carlos found himself at a point in life that he never imagined he would experience. The silence in his home, once a place of comfort and ostentation, was now almost unbearable. The echo of his own footsteps through the empty rooms seemed to amplify the loneliness that surrounded him. Every piece of furniture, every memory, seemed to whisper about the times when he believed he was in control of everything, when success was guaranteed and people respected him. But now, without the support of his former colleagues and friends, Carlos felt the weight of his human frailty for the first time. The people who once surrounded him were no longer around. His wife, tired of his arrogance, had left, taking with her the peace that, despite everything, maintained a thread of normality in his life. His business friends, who laughed at his sarcastic jokes and shared the same shallow ideals, shunned him as soon as his reputation began to crumble. It was as if suddenly he was no longer important. The feeling of isolation was profound and, along with it, came a hopelessness that Carlos didn't know how to deal with. The man who once mocked other people's faith now found himself in an abyss of questions. His old certainties began to crumble, giving way to doubts about the way he had lived up to that point. He wondered how he had gotten to this point, alone, with no one to support him or offer comfort. The life of luxury he cherished no longer meant anything. Money, which had always been his shield and his source of power, could no longer buy him back the comfort or prestige he had lost. I spent sleepless nights, lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The silence oppressed him, but at the same time, it was the only companion he had. He remembered the conversations he had with his former religious friends, the laughs he let out when they mentioned that faith helped them in difficult times. "Where is your faith now, Carlos?" he whispered to himself, almost bitterly. For the first time, he felt small, vulnerable, and, above all, powerless in the face of the vastness of life and the challenges it presented to him. Every day that passed was an internal struggle. Carlos isolated himself more and more, only leaving when absolutely necessary. The people he saw on the streets seemed indifferent to his existence. He, once a figure of power and influence, was now invisible. This was the most bitter lesson that life imposed on him. The insignificance of his pride in the face of chaos that he could not control. Every mistake he made, every relationship he neglected, now turned against him, like shadows from a past he ignored for too long. It was during this dark period that Carlos began to reflect on God. The name, which previously only came from his lips in a mocking tone, now took on a new dimension. He wondered if, perhaps, there was something greater than himself, something beyond his understanding and control. The words of his mother, who he used to despise, echoed in his mind. "There's more to life than what you see, Carlos. One day you'll understand that," she said. And now, perhaps for the first time, he was beginning to understand what she meant. The feeling of existential emptiness intensified. Carlos, who always thought he could live without the need for a greater purpose or belief, began to realize that something was missing in his life. Arrogance and skepticism, which had previously strengthened him, now seemed to be mainly responsible for his downfall. He felt the absence of faith like a hole in his soul, a void that neither money nor success could fill. It was a cruel but necessary lesson that life was teaching him. Sitting alone in his living room, surrounded by memories of a time when everything seemed easy, Carlos finally accepted that he needed to look inside himself. For the first time, he prayed. It was a timid, disconnected prayer, but filled with a sincerity he had never experienced. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know if anyone was listening. But in that moment, he was willing to open himself up to something bigger, something that could give meaning to his pain and his loneliness. It was a moment of surrender, of accepting that he was not invincible and that, perhaps, what he needed most was the humility to recognize his own weakness. In that moment of solitude and reflection, Carlos began to glimpse hope in the midst of hopelessness. He was still far from a solution to his problems, but arrogance had given way to humility, and disbelief, for the first time, was beginning to be replaced by the search for a faith he never knew he needed. That night, Carlos was more desperate than ever. He no longer knew who to turn to, nor what to do to find relief from the pain he felt in his chest. The walls of his home, once decorated with the symbol of his success, now seemed to suffocate him. Sitting in the living room armchair with his hands on his face, he wondered if there was a point of return, a way to right all the mistakes he had made over the years. His heart was beating heavy, and he felt like he was being crushed by the weight of his own choices. Without hope and overcome by an anguish that he didn't know how to control, Carlos fell asleep right there, amidst the suffocating silence. What happened next would shake him to his core. He dreamed of a vastly dark, endless landscape. On the horizon, a soft, almost imperceptible light began to shine. Little by little, it approached, illuminating everything around it. Carlos felt a strange and overwhelming peace take over his body, something he had never experienced. It was as if all the pain, anguish and guilt were being washed away by that light. Then, from within that light, he heard a voice. It wasn't a loud voice, but a firm one that resonated within him in a way that couldn't be ignored. "I've been here the whole time," the phrase echoed in his mind, and Carlos felt an electric current run through his body. This wasn't just a dream, it wasn't a simple hallucination caused by stress. He knew, in some inexplicable way, that he was having a spiritual encounter, something greater than he could comprehend. He finally understood that his arrogance, his laughter, and his disregard for faith had blinded him to this presence. When he woke up, Carlos felt his heart racing, but not from fear. For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. The glow of the dream was still in his mind. The feeling of that unshakable presence still weighed on him. He got up from his seat and looked around. What was once a cold, empty house now seemed to have a new meaning. He couldn't explain it, but there was something bigger, something he had ignored his entire life. And in that moment, he realized that this force had always been by his side, even when he refused to believe it. The dream, or whatever it was, had given him the clarity he needed. He understood that he didn't control everything, that success and money were fragile and fleeting. His belief that he was solely responsible for his life had been an illusion created by his own arrogance. Now, faced with this truth, Carlos felt small, but at the same time, protected by something much bigger than him. In the following days, he began to reflect more deeply on what had happened. He stopped mocking the beliefs of others and began to respect what he once despised. He felt an urgent need to correct the path he had taken and to reconnect with those he had alienated with his pride. His life, previously based only on material achievements, began to align with something more spiritual, deeper. Carlos didn't know how to tell his experience to the people around him, fearing that they would laugh at him, just as he had done so many times in the past. But he felt deep down that the lesson he had received was an opportunity to start again, to change his trajectory and come to terms with what he had rejected. The pride that once dominated his personality was replaced by a sense of humility. He knew he needed to make amends with everyone he had hurt, but most of all, he knew he needed to make amends with God himself. The experience was not only a spiritual turning point, but an emotional one as well. Carlos realized that all the emptiness he felt was a result of his disconnection with this greater force, with this divine presence that he had spent years denying. Now, he was ready to accept that he was not the center of the universe, that his strength and success came from something beyond himself. Life had taught him a bitter but necessary lesson. He finally realized that his arrogance had blinded him to the deepest and most beautiful truth of human existence. Carlos' journey was just beginning, but he was no longer lost. After the spiritual experience that shook his convictions, Carlos began to reflect intensely on the course of his life. He woke up every day with a weight in his heart, no longer of despair, but of regret. The memories of all the times he ridiculed the faith of others, of using sarcasm to feel superior, now came flooding back, and he felt ashamed. Sitting silently, he thought about how he had pushed away the people who truly cared about him, just to maintain a facade of power and self-sufficiency. That man who once laughed at God and other people's beliefs now saw his own arrogance as a reflection of his emotional fragility. The first memory that hit him was that of his mother. She had always told him that there were greater forces beyond human control, that respect for faith was fundamental, but Carlos always rejected her words with a disdainful smile. Now, those memories hurt. He realized that the arrogance he had used to hide his insecurities had only separated him from the people who loved him. His mother, in particular, had been a constant source of affection, and he wondered how many times his lack of sensitivity had hurt her deeply. Guilt slowly consumed him as he realized how much he had failed to return the love he had always received. At work, Carlos also began to see his flaws. He always liked to ridicule colleagues who spoke about their beliefs or who demonstrated any type of spirituality. He clearly remembered times when he had made fun of a younger employee who wore a crucifix and talked about his faith. At the time, it seemed funny to see the boy trying to reconcile his faith with the corporate environment. Now, Carlos saw his attitude as cruel and unnecessary, and it filled him with shame. He realized that in doing so, he had cut himself off from genuine friendships and opportunities to learn from the humility of others. Carlos realized that, over the years, he had built an armor of arrogance to protect himself from life's uncertainties. Laughing at God and religious people was actually a way of hiding his fear of not having complete control over his own existence. He always believed that money, success, and social status were enough to guarantee his happiness. But now, all of this seemed insignificant compared to the loneliness and emptiness he felt. The collapse of his financial and emotional life was the shock he needed to understand that his priorities were distorted. While reflecting, Carlos realized something fundamental. His actions, based on disbelief and contempt for the spiritual, not only distanced him from God, but also from people. He began to recognize that his decisions, his coldness and his selfishness had led to his distancing from friends, family, and colleagues. The inner peace he craved, he now understood, could not be bought with material success or status. It could only come through the recognition that there is something greater than himself in the universe, something he has spent his entire life ignoring. This deep regret led him to look for ways to redeem himself. Carlos knew he needed to apologize to his mother, to the people he had treated with disdain, and even to himself, for having allowed pride and arrogance to dominate his life for so long. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. The road to forgiveness would be long, and the scars he caused, especially in his closest relationships, would not disappear quickly. Over the next few weeks, Carlos began to make small changes in his life. He began to reconnect with the old friends he had alienated and sought out his mother, with whom he had a long and sincere conversation. She listened to him patiently, and although he knew forgiveness wouldn't be instantaneous, he felt he was on the right path. This journey of repentance was, for him, a new beginning, a chance to rediscover himself and find an inner peace he had never known before. Furthermore, Carlos began to look at the world around him in a completely new way. Where he once saw weakness in expressions of faith, he now saw strength. Where before he laughed at the belief in something greater, now he felt respect. He began to open up to the idea that life wasn't just what he could control, and that there was beauty in accepting that some things were beyond his understanding. Each step on his journey of reflection and change brought him closer to the peace he sought, and he knew that although the path was difficult, it was the only one that would lead him to true happiness. Carlos now understood that his contempt for God and his arrogance had led him down a path of isolation and despair. He was determined to change not just for himself, but for all the people he had hurt over the years. The man who once laughed at God was now someone who sought redemption, with humility and a heart open to learning from past mistakes. Carlos, after realizing the depth of his mistakes and the emptiness that his arrogance had brought him, decided it was time to change. He could no longer continue living with the burden of regret and guilt, and he knew that the only way to free himself from it was to seek redemption. In a gesture that he would never have imagined doing before, Carlos decided to enter a church, a place that he had always ridiculed, but which now represented an opportunity for transformation. As he walked through the doors of that sacred place, he felt a mix of nervousness and relief. It was a new beginning, and he was willing to embrace that chance. At first, Carlos felt out of place. Sitting in a church pew and listening to the pastor's words was something completely out of his comfort zone. He was used to controlling every situation and felt vulnerable giving his attention to something he couldn't control. However, as the days passed and he returned to church, he began to realize that, far from being a sign of weakness, recognizing the existence of something greater than himself brought an inner strength that he had never experienced before. Over time, Carlos began to seek spiritual guidance. He scheduled a talk with the pastor, someone he used to criticize and despise in his sarcastic jokes. During the meeting, Carlos opened his heart, confessing his mistakes, his pride, and how he had treated people over the years. The pastor listened patiently, offering not judgment but understanding and support. He explained that the path to redemption would not be easy, but that each step toward humility and forgiveness was a step toward the peace he sought. The change in Carlos did not happen overnight, but was gradual and genuine. Little by little, he began to reconnect with the friends and family he had alienated. The first step was to look for his mother, the woman he had so despised with his cynicism. During an emotional conversation, Carlos asked for forgiveness for all the times he laughed at his faith and disrespected his beliefs. His mother, moved, forgave him, but also warned him that true forgiveness would come when he demonstrated, with his actions, that he had really changed. In addition to seeking his mother's forgiveness, Carlos reached out to other friends and colleagues he had hurt over the years. One by one, he took the difficult path of apologizing and trying to repair the broken bonds. Although not everyone was willing to accept his regret immediately, Carlos did not give up. He knew that true change was not just a matter of words, but of actions. And this time, he was determined to show that his new perspective on life was not temporary. Humility, which previously seemed distant to Carlos, now became his ally. He learned to listen more and talk less, to respect the opinions and beliefs of others, and to understand that success is not only measured by material goods or professional achievements, but by relationships and inner peace. His pride waned, replaced by a new sensitivity toward the world around him and the people in his life. For the first time in a long time, Carlos began to feel like he was on the right path. Attending church and reconnecting with his spirituality not only brought Carlos a sense of relief, but also a new perspective on life. He began to see faith as a source of strength, something that helped him face daily challenges with more serenity and confidence. Your old view that only absolute control brought success was replaced by an acceptance that sometimes you have to rely on something other than yourself. This trust in God, something he had previously ridiculed, now gave him a peace he had never experienced. Carlos also began to get involved in charitable activities and volunteering, something he would never have considered before. He realized that helping others, especially those who were struggling, was a way to make up for years of selfishness. In doing so, he felt increasingly connected to the community and his life's greater purpose. His transformation was not only internal but also external, and soon people around him began to notice the changes in his attitudes and behavior. As his life followed this new path of humility and faith, Carlos felt he was finally finding what had always been missing in his life: true purpose. He no longer sought approval through material success or social status, but through the love and kindness he could offer to those around him. The path of redemption he chose was not easy, but each step he took led him to a place of greater peace and contentment. He had learned the lesson he had so avoided, and now he embraced life with a new light. Carlos had completely transformed. The arrogant man who once laughed at God and other people's beliefs no longer existed. Now he lived a life full of gratitude, peace, and purpose. Each morning was greeted with a silent prayer, something he had never done before. He woke up being grateful for every little detail, from the fresh air he breathed to the daily opportunities to be a better person. Carlos had learned that, no matter how much he had achieved in material life, nothing was more valuable than the spiritual peace that now filled him. The faith he had so ridiculed before was now his source of strength. In moments of uncertainty, instead of despairing or acting arrogantly, he found comfort in his connection with God. When problems arose in his life, he no longer felt obligated to control everything himself. On the contrary, Carlos had learned to trust that things would be resolved at the right time and in the right way. He finally understood the meaning of the word faith, something that had previously seemed so far from his understanding. Carlos also began to reach out to those he had once despised for their religious devotion. He reached out to those coworkers and acquaintances who, in the past, had been the target of his jokes and sarcastic comments. Instead of mocking, he now listened to them with respect and genuine curiosity. He wanted to understand what had kept them steadfast in their faith for so long, and this search for understanding made their conversations rich in learning and personal growth. Most notable, however, was the impact of his change on those around him. Friends and family, who had previously distanced themselves due to his arrogance, began to return to his life. They saw the sincerity in his transformation and welcomed him with open arms. Carlos had become a source of inspiration for many. His story of fall and redemption was shared as a powerful example of how no one is beyond salvation, and how it is possible to start over, regardless of past mistakes. Carlos also found new joy in helping others. He began volunteering for charities, offering his time and resources to help people in need. The pride that once defined him was replaced by the humility of serving, and he began to feel a deep joy in seeing the positive impact he could make on other people's lives. He discovered that by caring for others, he was, in a way, healing himself. In addition to volunteering, Carlos also began speaking at religious events and support groups, sharing his story with those who, like him, had already fallen away from the faith or were facing spiritual crises. He did not set himself up as an example of perfection, but as someone who had made many mistakes and still found his way back. His words, once filled with sarcasm, now conveyed compassion, humility, and wisdom. He understood that his journey could help others find their own path. Carlos' relationship with his mother also blossomed again. That devout woman he so disdained in his youth had now become his greatest spiritual ally. Together, they attended church, and Carlos felt immense gratitude for having the opportunity to rebuild that relationship. His mother, always patient, saw her son finally find what she always wanted for him: peace of mind and faith. They talked often about life, faith, and the lessons that time had taught them both. Carlos also reconciled with himself. He left behind the weight of guilt and regret, knowing that by surrendering to faith and kindness, he was walking a path of redemption. The new phase of his life was not about achieving perfection, but about recognizing his humanity, accepting his mistakes, and committing to live more fully and consciously. Each day was a new opportunity for him to show his gratitude for having been given a second chance, both by God and the people around him. In the end, Carlos became a living example that life can change drastically when you open your heart to faith. He learned that God's power was not in grandiose miracles, but in small, daily transformations, in the decisions we make, and in the love we share with others. His life was now guided by gratitude, humility, and compassion, and he knew that this was just the beginning of a new spiritual journey, a journey of faith and devotion that he would follow for the rest of his days.